So now that we have completed our watercolor practices and you know what the wet on wet technique and the wet on dry technique are, and you have now practiced mixing your intermediate or tertiary colors, it is time for us to now move on to our project. So for our project, we are going to take that circle that is going to become our mandala, and you have that provided to you with the 12 wedges. Each wedge is going to be a different color of the color wheel. You should have also at your work area your color wheel so that you can follow along to the color arrangement onto your mandala. You should have a brush bin with cold water and some brushes. You should have your plate for mixing colors, and you should have your watercolor set. Now, to begin, what I like to do is activate each of my colors. So, as I mentioned before, these colors and these paint sets are used in other periods. So they probably haven't had a chance to fully dry, so they're going to be semi-moist. What I like to do, since I want water in my watercolor, is to take the pipette that's in my basket and add a few drops to my watercolor just to start activating it and thinning out any paint that is already wet. Is it the only water I'll be adding to my paints? No, but it will get them started. Now for this, we're not going to use brown or black, so those should not be activated. We just want our 6 colors, our primaries and our secondaries. Now when we want to work in the same order we filled in our color wheel, and that is to start with our primary colors. And the reason why we want to do that is because if we just try to start filling in our color wheel, say if I start red here, and then red orange and yellow orange and yellow green and so forth, these edges where they touch are going to be wet. So my colors are going to want to bleed together. So let me demonstrate that to you. So I'm going to use a little bit bigger paintbrush here. I'm going to get my colors ready to go. So I know I want some red. So I'm just picking some up, transferring it to my plate. I find it helps to sometimes twist my brush. And if while you're doing that, the same thing happens to you that just happened to me, where a drop of red came out of my paintbrush, I take a slightly dry paintbrush and I just soak up that color that doesn't belong in there and wipe it off with my paper towel. So this is why I usually work with a thicker stack of paper towels at my work area. If it doesn't work with the paintbrush, then you could tear off a small piece of paper towel and soak that up. Now I'm going to bring over some orange paint also. So again, I find it helps to kind of twist my bristles, kind of forces some of that watercolor that's trapped inside of the bristles out and onto the plate. And I'm going to add a little bit more red to my plate here. And since I'm going to do 3 colors to demonstrate to you why we don't want to paint in the rainbow order of our color wheel, I'm going to go ahead and bring over some more orange paint so I can make up my red orange. I'm going to make my red-orange color. Okay, so that looks good. Now you have a choice here with your mandala in that you can work wet on wet or wet on dry. If you work wet on wet, you're going to first wet the area. So if I start in this wedge, I'm going to paint my red color, my primary color here. I want to stay within that wedge. So I slow down as I reach my edges. I use the very tip and the sides of the paintbrush to get up against my lines. And what helps is if you kind of look at your paper from the side, you can see the water glistening on the surface. And what I want is to see a wet texture to my paper. I don't want it to look like an ice rink, so I don't want it to be a smooth, shiny surface. And I don't want it to look slightly damp or dry. I want to still see some very shiny wetness on my paper surface, but I want to see the texture of the paper shiny. I don't want it to look like a piece of glass or ice. So once I have that, then I can come in and I can pick up my color, and you can do a gradient if you want to try that. So I'm going to lay down my color where I want it to be the darkest, and I'm going to let that bleeding effect that watercolor will do when it's on wet paper, and I'm going to encourage it towards the center of my color wheel of my mandala. And what I'm going to do is, as I get closer to the center, I'm going to take some of that pigment out of my paintbrush and just start dragging and thinning out that pigment as I get closer to the center so that it gets lighter. So if you do want to try a little bit of a gradient where it fades from one darkness of pigment to a lighter pigment, you can do so. And sometimes I'll just slightly tip my paper to help that darker pigment start working its way towards the center. If I have anything that looks like too harsh of a line, I just come in, spread that paint down a little bit. Try to even that out. Now if I want it just to be a solid wash, I don't want it to be a graded wash, I would just keep that amount of paint I had in my paintbrush and paint from outer edge to inner part of my mandala. And you could also do the gradient the opposite way. I could have it darker here, lighter out this way. But my goal is to make this my red wedge. Now as I mentioned, if I try to paint another color beside it while this one is still wet, because paint, watercolor, is attracted to that wetness, what could happen is either my red will start spilling over into my red-orange, and maybe that won't hurt too bad, but I want very separate, distinct colors. And you can see there already it's starting to bleed over into the other wedge. I want these to have a nice hard edge. So if I go ahead and just start painting here with my red-orange color, it could potentially, depending on how fast my wedge is drying, it could potentially start bleeding over into my red wedge. And again, I want each of these wedges to be individual colors and not to bleed together or mix together. So this is why we don't want to paint things, see there where it's bleeding. That's why we don't want to paint wedges beside other wedges that are still wet. So that's why we're going to start painting this in the order of our application when we went over the color wheel. So that means I'm going to do my primary colors first, and as they're drying I can come in and do my secondary, and then those will need some time to dry before I come in and do my tertiary or intermediates. But just to continue to illustrate to you, that red orange wedge is still wet. I'm now wetting my orange section, and see how already the red orange colors are bleeding over into my orange color. So when I start painting orange, it's not going to be a pure orange color there, it's going to have some color mixing there. And again, my goal is to have each of my wedges to be their own individual color of the color wheel, whether that is a graded wash like this or a solid wash like these two. Okay, so let me demonstrate to you what we want to do. Okay, so you can see I got some new water. I have a new mandala here, and one thing I didn't mention is when it comes to color mixing, you have this extra little space down here. We're going to eventually trim up this paper when we're done with our project, but if you need to test out colors, you can do that down here. Now, for this part, as I said, we want to start out with our primary colors. So I want to have my color wheel with me, and I want to decide where I'm starting. So it's really up to you where you start your primary colors. You can follow exactly as we had it with our color wheel, but as soon as you pick one wedge, what you could do is very lightly, so that it can be erased later, write a little symbol. I'm putting an R there for red, and then I know that I need to skip 3 spaces, and in the 4th one would be my next primary color, so I'm going to put a little Y up here for yellow, and I skip 3 spaces, and in the 4th space will be my last primary color, so I'm going to put a B for blue, and then that should leave me 3 spaces, and then red will be the 4th space. So remember, primary colors are triadic. They're equal distance from each other on the color wheel, so they should have an even amount of empty wedges between them. And remember, these wedges are representing the secondary color they mix and the tertiary colors that the secondary and primaries mix. So once I have that, then I'm ready to start painting. So again, if my paints are slightly dry, I'm going to add a few drops of water. So for this, I need to definitely make sure my red, yellow, and blue are ready to go. And my secondary color. So in one day, you should be able to get definitely your primaries, and most likely your secondaries also in the same class period. So again, you can work wet on wet or wet on dry. I do like the wet on wet technique. So I'm going to start by adding some water to my wedge for my red color. And again, I want to keep within the wedge. So I use the sides of my bristles to go right along that pencil line. I'll use the very tip of my paintbrush. So notice I like to use a round paintbrush when painting my mandala because I get a nice point in the round paintbrush. And again, I'm adding water until I see the texture of my paper shiny, glossy, and not looking just slightly damp and dry. When you do this, you will start noticing the difference. And I also don't want it to look like a piece of glass or a sheet of ice. I want the texture of the paper to be very shiny, noticeable, but I don't want so much water that there's no texture of the paper and I just see this bright shine from a puddle of water. So once I have that, I'm going to come in, pick up some red, and I do like to transfer it to my plate because remember I want to water down my paints. I don't want them to be too thick, and I'm going to start adding my red paint to my red wedge. So again, you can make this a solid wash, you can make this a graded wash, and what you'd rather do is have to go back and add a little bit more paint to your wedge area or onto your paintbrush than to have too thick of a paint in your watercolors. So by painting this wedge first, one of my primaries, it will not only help me establish the order of my colors, but as I said, once I have this painted, I can let this dry. I can go on to my other primary colors because they're not going to touch this wedge. And I give this a chance to dry and set up. So I'm just going to turn my paper. I'm going to go ahead and get my paint color ready here for my yellow. Get it transferred over to my plate. And if at all during this time your water becomes too dirty, too muddy, then by all means go get fresh water. A little bit of watercolor in it is, as you can see, not going to show up when you start applying water to the surface, so it's not going to affect the color. But when the water gets so saturated with watercolor, and when you start this part of the technique and you can see the water, not just this water shining on the texture of the paper, but you can actually see a pigment of the water, then you know it's definitely time to go get new water so you're not affecting your colors. So once I have this, I'm going to pick up my yellow, add a little touch more water to it, and again, graded wash or solid wash, that is up to you, but you want to fill in this wedge with the primary color yellow. And again, it's nowhere near my red, so I'm not going to run the risk of anything or it bleeding into anything. So nothing's going to bleed into it. It's not going to bleed into anything. Now as yellow sets up there, you'll notice that there's some puddling going on over here in red. So I'm going to take a drier paintbrush and just touch it to those puddles. And notice the drier paintbrush will soak up the puddles so that I can get a nice even color when that dries. So anytime you may have some watercolor puddling, that's all you have to do is take a drier paintbrush, tap it in, touch those puddles, and it will soak them up. So that leaves me my last primary color, which is my blue wedge. So again, I'm going to pick up some of my blue color, going to bring it over here to my plate. That way I can control how much water is in it. Clean out my paintbrush, and I like working with that wet on wet technique, so I'm going to come in, wet my blue wedge, and again I'm adding enough color so that the texture of the paper is very glossy, very shiny, but I can see the texture of the paper. And again, it's one thing for me to mention this on video, but it's not until you actually start working with this that you'll actually notice what I'm talking about. And after I paint this one, Maybe I'll pull out that other sheet we were using and see if the light in the room can catch what I'm talking about and show you on camera. So now that I have that, I'm going to add a little water here, and again, fill in my wedge. Want to keep it within that wedge. As best as I can. So again, use the side of my bristles, use the very point of my paintbrush to help move that paint to the very outer edges of that wedge. And looking at my yellow, I see down there near the point is starting to get a little bit of an area of puddle. So again, taking my drier paintbrush, touching it in there, soaking up some of those puddles. And I see one already forming here in my blue. So again, touch the drier paintbrush to those puddles. And notice I did wash out my paintbrush and dry it before I went from one color to another. So I do want to start the secondary ones on here, but let me see if on this other one I could give you an idea. Let's see if the camera and the lights in the room will pick up on what you're looking for if you work with wet on wet. So let's try zooming in here. A little bit more on the paper. Might not be able to focus well enough to do this, but let's give it a try. Okay, so when I start wetting my paper, if I have a lot of water, it's going to look just like a sheet of ice, or there we go. I almost had it there. Let me try zooming out a little bit more. See if we can catch that light again. There. See how that looks very smooth? It's a big puddle of water. I don't want that look. I want the texture of the paper to be shiny like that, but I still want to see the texture of the paper. So if I spread that water around, see how we can see the texture there of the paper, catching the light, that shininess on it. That's what we want. We want that shiny, glossy texture, not a sheet of very smooth looking paper. So that's what I'm talking about for the amount of water you want if you're working wet on wet, is that glossy, bumpy texture of the watercolor paper showing up. And it shouldn't look like a sheet of glass or ice. Okay, so that glossy texture. That's what you're looking for when you're working wet on wet. So we'll zoom back out here. So as I mentioned, since these are still damp, I don't want to work with my tertiaries, but I do want to start into my secondaries. And again, I can very lightly mark along the outside of my mandala what color goes where. So red and yellow make orange, so that empty wedge in the very middle between red and yellow, I'm going to put an O for orange. Yellow and blue make green, so that very middle wedge in between yellow and blue is going to be my green wedge. And of course, last but not least, blue and red make violet or purple, and that center wedge in between those is going to be that color, my secondary color. So once I have that, my water is getting pretty dirty, so I'm going to go change my water And before these dry, I want to show why we work in the order of our primary to our secondaries to our tertiaries, not only because it helps us lay out the colors of the color wheel in the correct order, but it allows us to paint those areas because they don't share a side. Let me grab some water. Okay, so I grabbed some fresh water, and you can see that my colors are still slightly damp. But that's okay, because now I'm going in with my secondary colors. They don't share a side or touch a side, so it's safe to paint these ones, and I won't have the fear of anything bleeding into the other. So I'm going to start between red and yellow with my orange. So I'm going to pull some of my orange paint over here onto my plate. And again, I like to put my colors on the plate so I can control how much water is in my mixture. With watercolor, I don't want my paint to be super thick. I want it to have some translucent qualities to it, meaning I can still kind of tell there's white paper under there. So I'm going to wet my wedge, in which I want orange to be applied to. And again, you have to be careful when wetting the wedge in which you're going to paint, because as we demonstrated in our practice, watercolor wants to follow that moisture. So if I sloppily paint and I go over into my other wedges here, it's going to show up because the watercolor is going to bleed over to that area. So I want to try to be very careful near my edges. Will you sometimes go a little bit outside the lines? Yeah, you can see there with my blue, I went out a little tiny bit. But that's also the reason why we go in this order, because blue green and blue purple are going to border that. So that's going to be okay. That will get masked with those colors. So once that is wet, I'm going to pick up my orange and paint inside this wedge. And again, you can make this a graded wash or a solid wash. That is up to you. Now you do have to be careful. Did you see what happened there when I was painting? Some paint splattered off my bristles, hit into my blue. Now blue and orange are complementary colors, so it's going to look a little grayish or even a little bit more of a darker blue. So I could try to correct that by taking that dry paintbrush again, seeing if I can soak that up. And what it's going to do though is also remove some of my blue paint. So I'm going to let that fully dry, and I'll probably then come back in and re-wet this whole thing and reapply some more blue paint. But if I start just trying to stick more blue paint on there now, it's going to create what we call a bloom, which is wetter paint forcing itself over and into areas that are still slightly damp and moist, and it creates this kind of weird hard edge. And maybe if that was something you were doing on purpose for a project or an effect on a project, that would be okay. But for these, we either want a graded or solid wash, so that's something I'll come back to later and correct. But for now, I just wanted to get that orange pigment picked up off of it. So I'm going to start letting orange dry, and I'm going to go on to green. So again, I want to pull some green onto my plate. And you'll notice that if you activate these paints at the beginning of class with water, they are starting to get a lot thicker because the moisture is just softening up our watercolor paints. Going to pick up, and again, my wet on wet technique. Just wet that wedge with water. And again, I want that shiny texture. I don't want a smooth sheet of glass. And once I have that, then I come in, and again, I'm going to add a little bit more water to my green and start applying it. So anytime you're working with watercolor, you do have to be careful, as I demonstrated earlier, and not on purpose, but these are things that just happen no matter how experienced you are. You know, as you're transferring color and paint from one area to another, it can easily drip off your paintbrush and onto your other colors in the set. Or as we saw there earlier, as I was painting, I flicked my bristles too hard and it splattered orange onto my blue. But even in the process of moving my paintbrush to the water dish or back to my palette, there's always a chance that some pigment, some paint could drop off of it. So just as best as you can, be very cautious and conscious of what you are doing and when you're doing it. I'm talking at the same time while demonstrating, so sometimes I make mistakes while doing that. So I see a little bit of puddling in my orange. So again, I'm going to touch that drier paintbrush, soak some of those puddles up. And I got a lot of puddling here in my green, so clean out my paintbrush, dry it out, and soak some of that watercolor up. And that might need another soaking also. We will see. So that leaves me with my last color of my primaries and secondaries, which is my violet or my purple. I don't mind which one you use in terminology. So I'm going to move and transfer that over to my palette. Again, so I can control the amount of water that is in there. Clean out my paintbrush. And I should be able to get one more wet on wet area. So I am noticing a little bit of pigment from my water there, but luckily it's purple. So since I'm in the purple wedge, it's not going to affect my color. So I'm not worried about it. But if you do, as I said before, start to get some really murky water, take the time, go change it. Because if I was in my lighter wedges, like a yellow green or a yellow orange, or even my yellow, if I started for some reason on my secondary colors, this color would definitely affect my yellow because they are complementaries, and it would definitely change the intensity of my yellow color. So once I have that applied, I'm adding a little bit more water to my paint, thin it out a little bit more, and fill in this wedge. Again, trying to stay within my lines as much as possible. And there's my primaries and secondaries. So this would be all the further I could get in one class period. And that is because, as you can see, my colors are still damp. So I'd run the risk of them bleeding into each other while they are in this state. Now, even though my red, my yellow, and my blue are not shiny anymore, they are still wet, and I can tell that because when I touch them, even though paint is not coming off of me and they don't feel wet like water, they feel cool, and that means there is dampness still there, which means that is still a risk for bleeding. So this is as far as I'd be able to get on my Mandala circle today. So I would want to make sure that my name is on my paper, so I'm going to put it down here in that extra space where we can test out our tertiary intermediate colors when we mix them. But I'm going to put my name down here, and this would now go to the drying rack. And if you have time to let it sit at your table for a little bit, especially after you're done with your last color, do so before putting it away. That way, if you have any puddling in your last color, like I'm getting there with my violet or purple color, you have a time and a chance to soak that up before it dries as a very dark spot. So this is as far as I'm going to get with this demonstration. In the next one, I'm going to come in and I'm going to go ahead and do my tertiaries. And once they are filled in, or also known as intermediates, once they are filled in, then I will make corrections to my blue wedge. I don't want to do this though in my next painting session, because then I won't be able to do two colors. So instead of having one wedge to paint on the third day, I would have two wedges to paint. So any corrections I'm going to make to this will wait until my next day of painting, after I'm done with my tertiaries or intermediates. Now to clean up, as I mentioned, this will go to the drying rack, so it's off your work surface. You will want to wash your palette and dry it and store it as you were given instructions the other day. You will want to make sure that your watercolor set is fairly clean. Sometimes what I do is, again, if there's little puddles, soak them up with a drier paintbrush, especially if they are in danger of mixing into another color, and wiping that off onto my paper towel. Just like that. Clean out my paintbrush, again, dry it. Only a dry or mostly dry brush is going to do the soaking up of the pigments. Otherwise, if it's soaking wet, it's just going to smear them around a lot. So once I'm fairly sure that that's nice and clean, or better than it was, then I am ready to store this. So I'll remind you that when you close this up, and this is why we don't use our lids for mixing, when I close this up and I go to move this back to its storage bin, I want to keep this flat and horizontal. I don't want to tip it at all, because any of those paints that are still very wet with water are going to run into each other. Once my paint set is put back in my bin, I'm going to make sure my paint brushes are clean, and again, I try to dry them off as much as possible so that they're not put away dripping wet. And these and pipettes either go back into the basket, or the pipette can be stored with the paintbrushes, and make sure you store the paintbrushes bristle side up. And then one of the last few things I'm going to do is take my water and my palette to the sink to clean. Now when you turn on the water for our sink, remember it comes on with high pressure, so don't have anything underneath the faucet when you turn it on. Turn on the water and then slowly turn the handle so it's a slow stream of water, because we don't want paint and water splashing all over our sink area. So I'm going to finish cleaning up, and in our next video I will talk about mixing and filling in our tertiaries for our mandala.